discussion to today's talk, because we said that today and tomorrow will be the two very important moments. Yeah, this is Evan Chen. That we will be concerned, because today we'll be talking about this colonial modernity, apparently in Taiwan, as we mentioned yesterday, from the early part of the 20th century, the Taiwanese intellectuals, artists, writers, thinkers, and philosophers, they share the same knowledge background with Japanese intellectuals, and also contemporary with Western Europe, like French and so on. So there are different points, like avant-garde and also surrealist and theoretical also issues that they participate in Taiwan. Of course, they wrote in Japanese. The really highly educated intellectuals mostly wrote in Japanese. Elder generation, they would write in Chinese. But tomorrow, a second movement that we will be also very interested, concerned, will be this also a global phenomenon. This 1956 secret report on Lenin's rule is that had a great impact on this communist societies, including China and Poland and Hungary, and also, of course, Vietnam. So those former party members will be denounced as revisionists. It's all the same. So we will also be looking forward to tomorrow's talk. It's a similar case with that Vu Trong Phung in Thailand. But yesterday there are several things that I drew my attention that I found it interesting. One thing, of course, is this 100 years Chinese rule from Han Dynasty onward to the 10th century. Even after Vietnam claimed independence, or they fought back the Chinese people, but they still remain their Chinese secrets, including the 科举考试, this examination system, and this bureaucratic system, and also this tributary system. Either it's rhetorical or it's real practice. It's interesting to see how they maintain either this concept of 天子 emperor, and also this 书院 local academy, and also all the classics, and of course 汉字权. The other thing that drew my attention was that we used to think of this northern Vietnam and southern Vietnam as this the communist Vietnam and this American victory. But from yesterday's talk, we noticed that it's actually existed through a long history. Not to mention the colonial rule, right? This dividing rule, this north, the south, and middle part. But also through the from 16th and 17th century, this northern Vietnam and southern Vietnam. It's all feudal lords, right? It's the same in China, the different dynasties. It's also all power procedure or struggle between different clans or different large families. You mentioned this. We call it 正式阮氏, so that is the Qing and the Ming blood. I don't know how to pronounce it. But from the 16th century to downward, so there's feudal lords partition or division of the land, and also several that oftentimes not only it's clan or like tribal power conflict, but it's also involves different mentality, ideology, sometimes ethnic, but it seems not. I don't know, maybe you can explain more. But one more thing brought up was that this Indochina is another issue that Vietnam actually, through the colonial government, they took this central position in terms of Cambodia and Laos. So it's another core periphery or this tributary relation that's practiced in East Asia and Southeast Asia. We also mentioned that this Sino-French war or this Taiwanese-French war at Keelung would fall back French. Otherwise, we could share some similar history with Vietnam. Yeah, and but there are other things we mentioned. Of course, there's a usage of independent language, romanization, or this industrialization of this colonial places, the railway and this different industry, plantation and mining and so on. But now colonial modernity will be today's focus. So how this intellectuals were educated through the colonial, so-called colonial French, intellectual and education system, will also introduce this political idea of federation or other republican and other things. So those are very interesting issues that we will be talking about. But I also would like to thank Klaus and Mitchell for introducing us to Professor Zinoman. We all know that he's a long-time director of this very famous journal of Vietnamese Studies for a long time, and also he's currently Professor of History in Southeast Asia Studies in UC Berkeley, founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies, and also director of Advanced Vietnamese Sciences, and also Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And he had been rewarded for 2 distinct awards from John King Fairbank Prize for East Asian History, and also Harry Benda Prize in Southeast Asia Asian Studies for his book, Colonial Bastille, History of Imprisonment in Vietnam, from 1852 to 1940. And his forthcoming book will be another very interesting. Do you have anything you want to add?
I think no. As yesterday Professor Zinoman said, this was very convincing.
All right. No, there's a long list. I can still
no
spend
need to
another
go
10,
into
20
any more
minutes.
detail.
But I want to give you the time for you to.
Okay. Thanks very much. I really appreciate that. Let me. Is that okay? Let me just start by thanking everyone again for coming today. I really appreciate the attendance, and I really appreciate the invitation from Professor Vu. Today, I'm basically going to talk about the most recent book that I've published, a book that was published in 2014, and it's titled Vietnamese Colonial Republican, The Political Vision of Vu Trong Phung. The book is basically a study of a great Vietnamese writer who died tragically in his native Hanoi in 1939, as you can see, at the tender age of 27. He's also known because his work was banned in communist Vietnam between 1960 and 1987, roughly for about a generation. Now, it's somewhat embarrassing for me to admit that I worked on this book for a little over 10 10 years, a little over a decade. But it makes me feel a little bit better that this book is actually the third book related to this figure, Vu Trong Phung, that I produced, or more accurately, that I co-produced during this period. The first book about Vu Trong Phung was a translation from Vietnamese into English of Vu Trong Phung's 1936 novel, So Da, the novel whose title we translate as Dumb Luck. This is a translation that I completed with my wife, Nguyet, and published with the University of Michigan Press in 2002-2003. The second book about Vu Trong Phung that I worked on, which came out in 2004-2005, is a collection of long-lost pieces of writing by Vu Trong Phung, or in some cases about Vu Trong Phung, that I was fortunate to find and unearth with the help of several other Vietnamese scholars in old newspaper collections and libraries and archives in Paris and Aix-en-Provence and Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, and actually also in Berkeley, in the Berkeley Library as well. These pieces were all published originally in the interwar Vietnamese press, so in other words, in newspapers between, actually roughly between 1930 and 1939, and they include a number of short stories, pieces of nonfiction reportage, political essays, book reviews, plays, poetry, criticism, and the only extended interview with this figure that's ever been, that we know about, that's ever been found. So basically, in the course of this 10 years of research, I spent a lot of time looking through these old newspapers, and I found, about 100 pieces. Now, his work, his major work, his novels, and other longer book-length works that he wrote had, of course, been known about for a while. But many of these pieces that I found had never been republished, hadn't been written about, and they add, I think, something significant to our understanding of this writer and his project. The third book, my new book, here's a picture of its cover, is the first research monograph in a Western language about this figure. The book basically explores 4 different things. One, it looks at the life and times of Vu Trong Phung. 2, it looks at more or less his entire body of work. 3, it examines various controversies that surrounded him, and these controversies include a very aggressive charge that he was a pornographer during his life. This is a charge that was launched against him during the 1930s, as well as a charge or an accusation that he was a counter-revolutionary political reactionary. This was a charge that surfaced after his death in really the mid-1950s. So the book looks at his life and times, his body of work, a series of controversies that have followed him both in his life and after his death. And finally, the book examines the nature of Vu Trong Phung's political project as expressed through his body of work. Vu Trong Phung was primarily a novelist and a writer of a certain kind of nonfiction, but he was not really a political pamphleteer or polemicist. He never wrote a manifesto. He never sat down and worked out a kind of coherent political philosophy. So my effort to sort of construct or to represent what his political philosophy might be was really based on a close reading of his novels, his fiction, and various other kinds of things that he wrote. Another way to describe the focus of this book is to say that it has sort of 2 basic objectives. And these 2 basic objectives correspond to two different audiences that I had in mind while I was writing the book. The first audience, I guess, could be thought of as non-Vietnamese readers or English speakers, or I guess anyone, not just English speakers, who doesn't read Vietnamese. And the vast majority of this group, I'm assuming, or I assumed, was totally unfamiliar with this writer, with Vu Trong Phung. And my objective here was basically to introduce this guy to them and to make a kind of case for his significance, maybe for his greatness, and hence for his inclusion in the canon, or at least the academic canon, of modern or maybe modernist world literature. And I'm not sure how successful this book is in achieving that objective. It's an academic book, it's a quite technical, scholarly book, but I do think that the translation of the novel, Dumb Luck, that I completed with my wife, has probably made a greater contribution to that, probably than this scholarly book will. That novel has been quite well received, quite well reviewed. It's now in its 8th or 9th printing out of the University of Michigan Press, which is quite unexpected for a Vietnamese novel written in 1936. It's been picked up in quite a number of courses in the United States and abroad, courses on Asian literature, courses on colonial or post-colonial literature, courses on global modernism. I sort of keep my eye out for syllabi. And this book is sort of gradually worming its way, I think, into the canon of, at least sort of academic canon of world literature in the U.S. and elsewhere. So that's one objective, which I think is sort of partially being achieved, to just sort of introduce this guy, make a case for his importance, and say that he sort of deserves to be read and deserves to be placed alongside other significant writers of his style and genre. For Vietnamese readers, in particular for educated Vietnamese readers, and for Vietnamese reading scholars of Vietnam, two groups for whom Vu Trong Phung should be very familiar. And indeed, in Vietnam, he's an extremely famous figure. If you go to a bookstore in Vietnam, almost every bookstore will have a section of Vu Trong Phung books, usually the largest section in the bookstore. My objective is a little bit different. This is not a group, Vietnamese readers or Vietnamese scholars, who needs to be introduced to this figure or needs to be convinced that he's an important figure. They already know this. Rather here, my aim is to offer a kind of revisionist interpretation of Vu Trong Phung's project and his politics, as I mentioned, expressed in his work. And ultimately, I sort of wanted to give this project a name. I felt like giving it a name would allow it to be remembered, compared, manipulated. And so I settled eventually on this idea of calling him a colonial Republican, and therefore the title of my new book, Vietnamese Colonial Republican, The Political Vision of Vu Trong Phung. Republican in this sense, in the United States, when I talk about the book, everyone thinks Republican. They think, Donald Trump or something, or the Republican Party. But here it very much refers to a French political tradition, a tradition that sort of has its origins with the French Revolution, and then with the various democratizing movements throughout Europe during the 19th century, movements that really have a very dramatic expression in the efforts, revolutionary efforts of 1848, and that are then sort of institutionalized in France during the Third Republic, founded in 1870. I offer Vietnamese Colonial Republican as a new conceptual category of political commitment, that I believe was shared or was felt by many Vietnamese intellectuals of the era. I also feel like it's a political position or a political commitment that retains some influence in the post-colonial period and even up to today. Towards the end of my book, I sort of talk about how this tradition of Colonial Republican has after effects, aftershocks, and still you can identify individuals or movements in late communist Vietnam, if you want to call it that, that still are faithful to or concerned with some of the concerns of this movement. And you know, part of my impetus for doing this reflects what I view as sort of the poverty of the political history of late colonial Vietnam. You know, there's a body of scholarship that talks about what politics were like in Vietnam in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and there's a number of categories of commitment that always appear in this kind of scholarship. Important intellectuals are referred to as nationalists or traditionalists or neo-traditionalists. Some are referred to as communists or anarchists. There's, you know, sort of a number of these kind of categories, collaborationists, etc. And in reading Vu Trong Phung's work, and especially trying to focus on the sort of political content of his work, I was struck by the fact that none of these categories seem to really do justice to the weird mixture of impulses that you could find there. Vu Trong Phung, in some respects, is extremely conservative, but in other respects is very progressive. In some respects, he seems like a real leftist, but as I will explain shortly, he was also bitterly anti-communist. So you know, I was sort of searching around for you know, which category might most fruitfully apply to him. And the closest one that I found was a category that a Vietnamese historian at Harvard, probably the most distinguished Vietnamese historian in the United States, a woman named Nguyen Ho Thai, some people may know her. She wrote a book about Vietnamese politics in the 1920s. She introduced the concept of radicalism as a kind of category for politicized youth in the 1920s. And my concept of Colonial Republican has certain similarities with her category of radicalism. She used that category in particular to refer to Nguyen, famous sort of pre-communist political activist during the 1920s and 30s. And Colonial Republican, I think, has some similarities to radicalism, but there's also some important differences. So basically today I want to talk briefly about each of these two components of the book, the introduction to the author, his life and times, and secondly, this argument about his political project, this argument about his republicanism. So let's start first with a little exploration of his life. Vu Trong Phung is born in Hanoi in 1912. Hanoi, as I talked about yesterday, was the capital of French Indochina. And he's raised by a young widow. This is the picture of his mother, who had emigrated to the capital from a neighboring rural province, Ha Dong province, which this is an area that was undergoing capitalist development during the first decade of the 20th century. A lot of farmers were being forced off their land as a result of the consolidation of land by various kind of agro-business interests. And we know that there's a tremendous rural-urban migration from Ha Dong into Hanoi during this period. And Vu Trong Phung's mother, his single mother, was part of this more general trend. Vu Trong Phung's father had died before he was 1 year old, most likely from tuberculosis. We don't know that much about Vu Trong Phung's mother, but we do know that she had come from a village that had traditionally engaged in handicraft textile production. And so it's not surprising that in Hanoi, she found work as a seamstress in a tailor shop in the old part of the city, a part of the city known as the 36th Streets. You can see on the right some images of this kind of old vernacular urban part of Hanoi from the early part of the 20th century. And Vu Trong Phung was born in this really quite densely populated part of the city and grew up there. And this urban environment provides the setting for many of his novels, many of his short stories sort of chronicle life of urban residents of this part of Hanoi. In 1918, at the age of 6 or 7, Vu Trong Phung enters school. And this is actually a very important year, 1918, because it's the year that a new progressive governor general of Indochina, a man named Albert Sarraut, introduces quite radical educational reforms into the colony that deeply affect Vu Trong Phung and other boys, primarily of his generation. In essence, Sarraut is a kind of progressive reformer, colonial reformer, a staunch French Republican, and so he introduces free, secular mass schooling for the first time. Prior to 1918, only the children of the Vietnamese elite had access to any kind of colonial-sponsored education, including Catholic schools. Had Vu Trong Phung been born really only a decade earlier, he likely, given his class background, would have remained illiterate or maybe functionally literate in Chinese characters. But because of the kind of fortuitous timing of his education, he enters schools at a time, or he's able to enter school, a local neighborhood school in the 36th streets, and he's able to take part in this new kind of educational curriculum that's being provided there. What are the important components of this educational curriculum? Well, I talked a little bit about some of them yesterday. I think the most important in terms of his later intellectual development and development as a writer is that in these new schools, French is one of the primary mediums of instruction. There's no Chinese characters that's taught. And this Romanized script that had been devised by French Catholic missionaries in the 17th century, lay dormant for several centuries, but then is picked up by Sarraut and other educational reformers for a variety of reasons, again, as I talked about yesterday, and used as the primary medium of instruction in school. So Vu Trong Phung was really part of the first generation of Vietnamese intellectuals who does not get this sort of Chinese-style education, either in terms of the language or in terms of the ideas that are conveyed through that language. He doesn't study the Confucian classics, for example. Rather, he learns this weird new Romanized script, a script that, as I again mentioned yesterday, one of its quirks is there's no literature in it, right? It's a language that's been produced, but it hasn't come into general use at this time. Students in school sort of learn how to read and write in it, but there's nothing really for them to read. And as a result, Vu Trong Phung and a lot of friends and colleagues from his generation throw themselves very enthusiastically into French literature and sort of the availability of French newspapers, French novels, various kinds of French texts that are making themselves increasingly available in libraries and bookstores and other kinds of mediums as a result. So Vu Trong Phung reads French and he writes in this new Romanized script. Interestingly, he doesn't write in French, and that's also sort of generally characteristic of this generation. Some of them write in French, but in general, they write in this new script, and they, like Vu Trong Phung, as we'll see, they tend to be this generation tends to be incredibly prolific. It's almost as if they set out to sort of create a Vietnamese tradition, a literary tradition in this new script where none had existed before. In addition to learning these new languages, French and the Romanized script, Vu Trong Phung and his peers absorbed a certain amount of what we might think of as French civics or Republican civics. So the colonial education system is not identical, obviously, to the French education that's offered in the metropole, but nevertheless, the kind of cliched values of the Third French Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity, the history of the French Revolution, the history of struggles in France against monarchical despotism, against the obscurantism of the church, etc. The sort of, what the French think is great about France, its political glories, its political accomplishments. The French in the colony can't help themselves. They can't help teaching their Vietnamese and also the Cambodian and their Lao students some of these values, despite the fact that the colonial state is a bit of a police state. It's not really offering equality or liberty, but nevertheless it sort of touts France's role in world history as a deliverer of these values. It's actually one of the kind of central hypocrisies and contradictions of the French colonial project. I think it's one of the things that makes French colonialism a little bit different than, say, Dutch colonialism or British colonialism. Those colonialisms also, sort of sing the praises of Holland and England, but I think not quite to the extent of the French. The French are unusually proud of their own tradition, their political traditions, etc. This plays, I think, a kind of outsized role in the educational curriculum. Around 1925 or 1926, when Vu Trong Phung was about 13 or 14 years old, he drops out of school. His mother has had to take in her parents and to support them financially. And although school is free, Vu Trong Phung is forced to look for work to contribute to the family budget. And so at this time, he looks for work, and he eventually finds a position at a department store. It's actually the biggest and most swanky department store in Hanoi, known as the Godard department store. Anyone who's been to Hanoi will know that this is today Chang Tien Plaza, right at the corner of Hoan Kiem Lake. It's still not, it's no longer the swankiest department store in town, but it's still a quite fancy department store and is located right in the center of town. During this period, Vu Trong Phung works initially as a guard for bicycles kept in the garage. He's eventually taught how to type, and through this he's able to be promoted to various kind of more white-collar type posts in the department store. And he eventually becomes a clerk. Works for several years as a clerk in this department store. And this, again, the 36th Streets, the old urban quarter of Hanoi, is one of the central stages in which his stories are set. White-collar offices are another very common setting for Vu Trong Phung's work. One of the interesting things about Vu Trong Phung is he almost never writes about the countryside, almost never writes about the peasantry. Almost all of his fiction is set in the city, and it tends to be set in these sort of very urban kinds of institutions, cafes, schools, department stores, etc. Vu Trong Phung eventually leaves this job. There's some controversy about whether he's quit or whether he's fired, but we know that eventually he ends up finding alternative work at a series of newspapers that have been founded in Hanoi at this time. Initially, because of his typing ability, he gets a job simply as a clerk typist, but gradually he graduates from that position and begins to work as a copy editor and eventually as a reporter and as a writer. I just want to point out that, I think this is one of the important elements of his biography, the fact that Vu Trong Phung is someone who comes from really a poor background, a working class background. He eventually graduates into this kind of white collar world. But it's one of the things that really distinguishes him, I think, from many of the other, sort of great colonial era writers in Southeast Asia. When we think of Southeast Asia's greatest writers of this era, we think of people like Jose Rizal, the great Filipino nationalist and writer, or Kartini, the great Indonesian nationalist and writer. These are all people who sort of come from an indigenous aristocratic class, and they get the best education and the best sort of breeding that those societies have to offer. So Vu Trong Phung is really a different kind of figure. I think another person I was thinking about when I was studying him was a Chinese comparison would be Lu Xun. There's a similar time period, and actually some quite interesting similarities in terms of politics and style. But again, Lu Xun is a doctor, has a very advanced education, is a very sort of sophisticated person as a result of that. I think Vu Trong Phung is quite different than that. He's much more of an autodidact. He has some schooling, but really he has about 5-6 years. He drops out of school. He has to work to support himself. He has to work to support himself his entire life. So it's one of the things that I think that really marks him as somewhat unique for his generation. In any case, Vu Trong Phung starts to work in newspapers about 1929 or 1930. And as with his entry into school in 1918, this is also a very fortuitous time, a very interesting time, a very lucky time for someone to start working in the Vietnamese press. The 1920s is a period of great economic boom in the colony, and this translates into the growth of serial publication. The late 1920s witnesses a kind of explosive growth of the press, and during the 1930s, despite the end of this boom and the beginning of a kind of bust that results from the global economic slump penetrating into Vietnam, there's about 400 to 500 newspapers and magazines that are founded in the colony during this time. Because of the educational reforms that Thoreau introduces in 1918, we also get the growth of a reading public, people who are able to read these newspapers. So there's a kind of economic context for the growth of the press, so there's a growth in literacy. This has a couple of important implications for Vu Trong Phung. One is there's enough newspapers around that someone can earn a living. For the first time, really, as a newspaper man, you could get a job at one newspaper. You could, if you're successful, if you're talented, you can get hired away by another newspaper. People who are talented tend to move from newspaper to newspaper or write for various newspapers at the same time. And the identity, newspaper man or press person or reporter, sort of is invented during this period. Prior to this period, there have been newspapers that have been introduced by the French beginning of the 1870s, 1880s, and people had written for them, but they didn't really consider themselves newspaper men with the kind of style and the kind of character that a newspaper person, cynical, hard-bitten, people who often sort of stayed up late at night, drinking coffee, wearing berets, chatting in cafes, smoking opium. There's a kind of lifestyle and a kind of quality of life that begins to go with this new identity, and Vu Trong Phung is really at the cutting edge of this kind of new identity. In 1930-31, at the age of about 17, these newspapers that he's working for, again, initially as a typist, later as a copy editor, eventually as a reporter, begin to publish short stories bearing his byline, Vu Trong Phung, or VTP, his initials. He also has a couple of different pen names that we know about. During the early 1930s, 1931, 1932, there's about 40 short stories that we have recovered, primarily of a realist or a naturalist style that appear bearing, again, his signature. At the same time, during 1930, 31, 32, Vu Trong Phung begins to publish translations. These are translations, on the one hand, of short stories, but also a variety of other kinds of things, pieces of nonfiction, pieces of reportage. He translates things from French newspapers into the Vietnamese Romanized script. Some of the figures that he translates during this period are Victor Hugo. He translates more. Victor Hugo is the figure he translates more than anyone else. And the longest piece by Hugo that he translates is a very famous introduction that Hugo wrote in the 1830s to a play that he wrote called Cromwell. This is called, the introduction is called Preface to Cromwell. And this is a short text by Hugo that's often seen as Hugo's manifesto for French Romanticism, especially for French Romanticism in the theater. It sort of describes and defines what Romanticism is and what its values are, what its quality is. And Vu Trong Phung translates this. And it's an interesting decision by him to sort of translate this very famous manifesto of French Romanticism. At the same time, during the same period, he publishes quite a number of short stories by Guy de Maupassant and by Émile Zola. Now, Zola and Maupassant are also great French writers from the 19th century. Unlike Hugo, who's more associated with the early 19th century and the mid-19th century, Zola and Maupassant are associated with the late 19th century, whereas Hugo is associated with French Romanticism. Zola and Maupassant are much more closely associated with French realism and also French naturalism. Naturalism is a kind of variant of realism, a kind of scientific variant of realism that's really spearheaded by Zola. Zola is, Zola and is a sort of towering figure in French naturalism. There's no one who's really kind of remotely as important to the tradition of naturalism as Zola. And Zola's greatest disciple is de Maupassant. Just as Vu Trong Phung publishes Hugo's Preface to Cromwell, this manifesto of Romanticism, he also publishes de Maupassant's Manifesto to Naturalism, which is a introduction to one of de Maupassant's novellas written in the early 20th century. He also translates a weird mix of other things, including some neoclassical drama, figures like Molière and Racine, de Vigny, and he publishes translations of a bunch of kind of minor figures who are not well known, sort of penny dreadful authors, sensational pulp fiction, and in a short study that I published that was separate from the book, and it's a study in which this term provincial cosmopolitan that I use in the title of this talk comes from. I basically looked at all of the references to foreign writing found in Vu Trong Phung's body of work, including both his translations but also his citations to foreign writing. And one of the things that I discovered in the sort of roughly about 100 different figures that he mentions is that there's very little kind of logic or systematic order to his engagement with French literature. Basically, Vu Trong Phung is citing figures over about a 600-700 year period. Even though he himself, he describes himself quite aggressively as a realist, Vu Trong Phung does, most of the figures that he translates and most of the figures that he praises come out of the French Romantic tradition, even though there's realists and naturalists there as well. Basically, there's something about his kind of autodidactism, the fact that he doesn't really have a systematic education, that I think helps to produce this kind of strange cosmopolitanism that I refer to in this piece as a provincial cosmopolitanism. He's basically someone who's very curious about the outside world, but he doesn't have any kind of formal training He never, and because he's poor, he never has an opportunity to visit Europe. He never has an opportunity to visit, museums or libraries or universities. His access to the wider world is constrained by the fact that he comes from this very remote, sort of marginal part of the world, and sort of accesses these texts in a very kind of herky-jerky, unsystematic kind of way. There might be a novel that's left behind on a train that he picks up and he reads, and that's all the Stendhal that he's ever read, just one novel. And then instead of going and pursuing and reading all of Stendhal's work, he then finds another novel that some friend gives him that's from 100 years earlier, and he reads that as well. So this is kind of, I think, really lovely, unsystematic, kind of crazy quilt character to his reading and to his intellectual engagement with the West. Again, something that I think really distinguishes him from people like Jose Rizal or Cartini, these much more formally educated figures who live at roughly the same time. In 1933, at the age of about 21, Vu Trong Phung abruptly achieves his first commercial and critical success with the publication of a work in it's essentially a new kind of genre. The work is entitled Cam Bai Người, which can be translated as the man trap or the human trap. And this is essentially a piece of first-person, nonfiction reportage that describes the lives and the livelihood of gamblers, conmen, grifters, and card sharps. You can see this is the picture actually of the book cover from the 1930s, and there's a 10 of hearts there. These are people who, the book looks at people who basically live in the 36 streets, this area that he goes up, and they go out on the street at night and they basically play these kind of, what looks like games of chance with passerbys, but the games of chance are all fixed or rigged in some way. And Vu Trong Phung penetrates into the world of these figures, befriends some of them, and describes their lives, describes their tricks, describes their cons. This is a sort of phenomenon that many people are aware of, this sort of urban con artistry. But Vu Trong Phung's reportage is the first effort to sort of get behind the screen, get inside, see what the real story is with these, this sort of fascinating image of the urban underworld. The work is initially serialized week by week in the newspaper that he's working for. It comes out, I think, over about 10 weeks. It's a 10-week, it's a 10-chapter piece. It generates sort of massive readership, massive critical response. No one's ever seen anything quite like this before. It's quickly republished, makes him a tidy sum of money, this sort of sets him off on a new chapter in his career where he's working for a period exclusively in this genre. Now this genre, which is known in Vietnamese as phóng sự, this kind of first-person ethnographic reportage, is not obviously an indigenous Vietnamese form, but it's sort of a global genre that's developing during this time. We can think of people like George Orwell, who at the exact same time is writing things like Down and Out in Paris and London, right, about the life of the poor in those two big cities. The Road to Week-on-Pier, it's a study in which Orwell goes and lives with coal miners in the north of England, writes about their life, also writes about the experience of a middle-class writer trying to fit in with coal miners. It's sort of part of the appeal of this genre is that it's both an objective description but also a subjective account of what it's like to be a reporter. There's of course versions of this kind of writing that are developing all over the world. In the United States, there's people like John Reed or John Dos Passos. In France, there's people like André Gide, who writes a very famous reportage around this time, including a very well-known study of French colonial rule in the Congo, called The Voyage to the Congo. Vu Trong Phung, we know from his citations, has read a number of these French versions of this global form, including André Gide, who's a quite important figure for him. So Phung is working within this new sort of global form. I should say that Vu Trong Phung is not the only Vietnamese writer to work in this form. He's actually preceded by a guy named Tam Lang, who is the editor of one of the newspapers that Vu Trong Phung works at. Tam Lang, in the year before Vu Trong Phung publishes Nguyen, publishes a piece of reportage called Toi Keo Se, I Pull a Rickshaw. And this is an account in which Tam Lang, this middle-class journalist, for one day works as a trishaw puller and describes, what the life of trishaw pullers is like, and also what it's like as a, weak, physically frail journalist to try to do this job and to try to fit in with these trishaw figures. This work, as I said, is commercially very successful, and it then provokes, I think, Vu Trong Phung to follow up this work with a number of additional works in the same genre. In 1934, Vu Trong Phung publishes this work on the left or the right, this work right here, Come Pay, Come Go. This is another piece of nonfiction reportage that looks at the lives of domestic household servants who work in the households, both of French, middle-class French families and upper-class Vietnamese families in Hanoi. And Vu Trong Phung for this goes undercover as a household servant. He goes to a market where household servants get hired, and then he works in the house of some rich families. He interviews household servants. He describes their life. He includes in this reportage sort of extensive interviews with household servants, some as young as 8 or 9, some older ones. It's extremely sort of both sympathetic but also very funny account of what the lives of these servants is like. In the middle is another piece of reportage that he publishes slightly later. Look, see, that could be translated as venereal disease clinic. And this is a study of, as you might guess, Hanoi's largest venereal disease clinic. Vu Trong Phung takes advantage of a visit to Hanoi from the French Ministry of Labor. The French Minister of Labor gets a tour of the biggest venereal disease hospital in the city. Vu Trong Phung tags along and is able to convince them to allow him to stay for a couple of days, interviewing the doctors, interviewing the nurses, interviewing the prostitutes who are being treated there. He then follows up this site visit with sort of greater investigation of prostitution in Hanoi. He goes to brothels and houses of prostitution, and he produces this, I think it's incredibly detailed, incredibly valuable study of prostitution in colonial Hanoi, both this treatment of venereal disease and the lives of prostitutes. Obviously he doesn't work as a prostitute, but he does sort of go along for the ride on various kinds of investigative missions into this netherworld. On the other side is his fourth great work of reportage, Nguyet. This could be translated as the industry of marrying Westerners. And this is a reportage that Vu Trong Phung carries out in a series of villages that have cropped up around a military base camp for the French Foreign Legion. And these villages are peopled by Vietnamese women who have become sort of common law wives or concubines of the soldiers who are assigned to the base. And many of these soldiers are allowed to live in these villages with these women. In some cases, they're actually formally married, but in most cases, they're sort of in long-term, relatively stable conjugal relationships. They have children who they raise jointly. They eat together. They obviously sleep together. And again, this is one of these subcultures that a lot of people at the time know about and are sort of fascinated by, but they don't really know that much about how it works. And Vu Trong Phung goes into this village, meets these women, and also meets some of their common law husbands, conducts a series of very interesting and funny interviews with them, and publishes this sort of inside world of mixed marriages, and also the lives of the offspring of these mixed marriages, mixed race children or mixed race teenagers or young adults. Because of the sort of nature of the market at the time, each one of these works of reportage, these book-length works of reportage, each of which is initially published in newspapers, serialized newspapers, and then put together as published books. Each one is more successful than the next. And Vu Trong Phung, as Philip mentioned in his introduction yesterday, eventually earns the reputation, the king of Vietnamese reportage. And by the time the last one of these reportages is written, he's only about 23, 24 years old. So he's still quite young, and he's been working in this kind of new form for the last couple of years. 1936 represents a dramatic turning point in Vu Trong Phung's literary career. Because in this year, for the first time, really, Vu Trong Phung decides that he's going to abandon this genre, phóng sự or reportage, this genre that's been very good to him, that's really made his name, and he's going to turn his hand to novel writing. This change is remarkable because in about a 15-month period from January of 1936 to about June of 1937, Vu Trong Phung publishes in rapid succession 4 long novels, 4 novels in about an 18-month period. And these are not short novellas. These are novels from about 300 to 500 pages. Again, all these novels are initially serialized, chapter by chapter, actually the 4 novels are serialized in 3 different newspapers. So 2 of the novels appear back to back in one newspaper, and then 2 other of these novels appear in different newspapers. And if you look at the timing of the serialization, one of the really quite remarkable things is that there are periods when Vu Trong Phung is serializing 2 of these novels at the same time. He's writing one chapter for one novel and one chapter for another novel, keeping them up, keeping them going. And there are even some memoirs, some accounts of Vu Trong Phung's writing process. He used to write in cafes, sort of in public, hunched over a desk. And he would, according to these accounts, ask people, was this character from that novel or that novel? Sometimes he couldn't even keep track of the plots and of the various characters that he was playing with. This to some extent is part of my feeling that Vu Trong Phung is an unusual figure. He's not just a normal, interesting writer like all other writers. He's unbelievably productive. Really kind of, the combination of his productivity and his youth, I think is, there's very little precedent for it actually in sort of world historical comparative terms. Moreover, it's not just that he's writing so much and at such a young age, but there's a really amazing diversity in the kinds of novels that he's writing. So here we have these 4 novels that he publishes in this 18-month period. And one of the really crazy things about them is that they represent really different kind of literary novelistic genres. The first novel that he writes, it's actually the one at the bottom corner with the head. Zonto, a novel that can be translated as The Storm, is essentially a kind of political melodrama. It's a big, sprawling novel. It focuses on a conflict between a rich business tycoon and a young peasant girl who he rapes in the first chapter of the novel, and then the rest of the novel sort of looks at how the businessman's family and the peasant girl's family deal with the consequences of the rape. This novel, about halfway through this novel, a communist agent appears who it ends up, used to be a childhood friend of the businessman, and he sets in motion a plot to wreak revenge against the businessman on behalf of the peasant girl. It's kind of a crazy story, but it's a big, sprawling novel with dozens of characters and all kinds of interesting plot reversals and etc. It's a sort of political melodrama. That's the first novel that he publishes during this 18-month span. The second novel that he publishes, which is the other one at the bottom of the screen, Soda, Dumb Luck, is, I don't know if anyone has been able to look at the translation, but it's essentially a sex farce. Not realistic, not melodramatic, incredibly funny, kind of parody of the rage for modernization amongst the Hanoi middle classes and upper classes during this period of sort of late colonial rule. And he's basically interested in mocking middle-class Vietnamese who ape or mimic French styles and French fashions. It's a novel that, in addition, has a very kind of intricate plot where sort of little seeds that are planted in the early chapters blossom in later chapters, and things that you think are just sort of random details end up being quite critical aspects of this quite complex and very, very funny and very dirty and very bawdy kind of comedy. When I wrote there's some, well, okay, I'll move on from that. Then we have this novel up in the upper right hand, the red cover, Vade. That's a title that can be translated as The Dike Breaks. Now this novel is generally considered by Vietnamese literary historians to be the first example of Vietnamese socialist realism. This novel opens when a dike is smashed by floodwaters and a rural community. It's actually one of the only novels in which Vu Trong Phung writes about the countryside is flooded, and the rest of the novel shifts back and forth between the sort of decadent lives of upper-class Vietnamese in the city and the misery of rural Vietnamese who are trying to deal with this flood. And in the midst of this story, there's one character who goes on a journey of political enlightenment, a journey from sort of middle-class bourgeois reformism to more radical political organization. It's one of the first Vietnamese novels to depict a strike amongst laborers who work on the dike. It's a novel that depicts actually life inside radical communist newspapers that are being published in Hanoi at the time. It's, I think, unlike The Storm and Dumb Luck, it's not a great piece of literature, but it's a very interesting piece of literature. And stylistically, it really doesn't have that much in common with the other two. It's really, I think this sort of, the fact that it dramatizes this master plot of socialist realism. And we know, actually, that Vu Trong Phung, in addition to reading all this French stuff, is beginning to read some Soviet literature, socialist realist literature, both in its French incarnation and its Russian incarnations, is beginning to penetrate into the colony. And here we see Vu Trong Phung exploring this genre as well. And then finally, we have this fourth novel, Lam Di, which can be translated as to be a prostitute or to be a whore. Now, this is a very interesting novel as well. I argue in my book that it's the first novel that is explicitly organized around Freudian ideas. The basic plot is the narrator, a young man, goes out carousing with a friend, and they end up at a brothel. The sex worker is brought out to them, and the narrator recognizes the sex worker as a girl who he went to school with, who was a very high class, was from a very high class family and was a very good student. And the narrator is shocked. How did this girl, who everyone admired and thought was very, cultured, etc., how did she come to work in a brothel? And so he after this opening chapter, he poses to her, well, how did this happen to you? And she says, well, I'll tell you the story. And Vu Trong Phung, the narrator, then takes out his notebook and records the story. So 9/10 of the novel is essentially the recording in a notebook of a woman's description of how her life went from sort of middle class down to the what Vu Trong Phung clearly thinks is the depths of depravity. But what's I think then there's something kind of Freudian about this. The woman on the couch and Vu Trong Phung, the narrator, taking this down, right? But the most important part of her story, how she became a prostitute, is located in her childhood and her adolescence. And it describes in very graphic detail, extremely graphic detail, a lot of the accusations that Vu Trong Phung is a pornographer comes out of this novel, her early childhood sexual experiences, being fondled by an uncle, having an early boyfriend when she was 11 or 12, as well as episodes of sort of irrational repression, sexual repression, she's subjected to by her father, by her parents, etc. So, the 1930s is a period when, sort of, again, in a very unsystematic way, Freudian ideas are beginning to filter into the colony, I was able to identify some, popularizations of Freud that Vu Trong Phung may have read. In the introduction to this novel, he mentions Freud, and he also mentions a guy named Vacher, who's often considered the French Freud, a figure who introduced Freud into France in the 1930s. So we've got, what's the bigger point here? The Storm, a political melodrama, Dumb Luck, a sex farce, The Dyke Breaks, an early example of socialist realism, To Be a Whore, a novel that's explicitly Freudian in its structure and in its themes. This is not, again, a sort of typical body of work. We don't see, it's not that he produces 4 works that are all kind of versions of one model or one mode. He's, very aggressively, very relentlessly sort of exploring all of these new kinds of models and new kinds of approaches. Each one of these novels, for different reasons, generates large sales. As you can imagine, they also generate a very lively critical discourse. Some people love them, some people hate them. There's good reviews, there's bad reviews. There's what critics of the time referred to as pen wars. 1936-37, the press is filled with articles about Vu Trong Phung's work, as well as Vu Trong Phung's defense of his own work. So he gets out there, he responds to his critics, describes what he's doing, rationalizes what he's doing, and in particular, in response to accusations that he's a pornographer, that his work is too dirty, he very aggressively defends himself, and he looks at examples of French writers from the era and earlier who had also been accused of being pornographers. He compares himself to them, compares himself to Zola, etc. Essentially he becomes a kind of literary and civil society celebrity. I think you can see here why there's something unusual, remarkable about this figure as a result of this period in his life. And one other thing I'll say about this is that it's not just that he writes so much, it's not just that he's so young, it's not just that he writes in all these different genres at the same time, but I think there's a very good argument that The Storm and Dumb Luck, 2 of these 4 novels, are still amongst the greatest pieces of literature, modern literature, that have ever been produced by Vietnamese. Why do I think this? well, when I decided that I wanted to translate a piece of Vietnamese literature, I basically asked, several score people, intellectuals, professors, writers, what should I translate? What is a piece of Vietnamese literature that should be available outside of Vietnam? Dumb Luck was almost everyone said, Dumb Luck, this is our great work. The Storm was a close second. So these works were seen as very significant at the time, but they've also stood the test of time. And now, 80 years, 90 years later, they still, they haven't really dated. Dumb Luck in particular has this very kind of sarcastic, modern voice that does not read like something that is from a different time period. There's something about it that's extremely contemporary, and it's just, a kind of remarkable achievement. In 1937, after this incredible flurry of productivity, Vu Trong Phung gets sick. He's diagnosed with tuberculosis, tries to treat it with opium, gets sicker, continues to write intermittently, produces actually another interesting novel from his sick bed, a novel titled Winning the Lottery, published in 1938, but he grows enfeebled by the disease, doesn't respond to medicine. It looks like the opium that he takes, thinking that it might prolong his life, actually has the opposite effect. And in October 1939, Vu Trong Phung abruptly dies at the age of 27. Given that his death occurs so soon after this incredible spasm of productivity, the story circulates that he essentially wrote himself to death. I think there's some logic to it if you see this sort of this kind of output that precedes his demise. This is a caricature that was drawn of him when he's on his deathbed in 1939. He's there's then a large funeral that's held in Hanoi with a massive number of mourners and grievers coming out into the streets to march behind his casket, a huge outpouring of grief. Tao Dan, which is one of the important literary magazines of the era, runs a special issue dedicated to him. This is December 1939, a couple months after he dies. Many of the greatest Vietnamese writers of the era, write sort of memoirs or appreciations of him that are published in this issue. As you can imagine, for me, this was an incredibly important source, both for his biography, but also for his reputation. Okay, so in summation for this part of the talk about his life, we have, a great writer, crazily productive, dies really young, extremely controversial, a master of several forms, both the novel and reportage. As a result of all of these things, but particularly about this as a result of this last factor, in my book, one thing that I do early on is I think a little bit more systematically about a comparison between Vu Trong Phung and George Orwell. Orwell also dies very young, is also crazily productive. Orwell was also a very rare figure in modern literary history who is often seen as a master of two different literary forms, which forms the novel and reportage. And it's actually quite rare. There are people who are great novelists, there are people who are great reportage writers, but to have someone who's great at both, and with Orwell, can you say what's his greatest accomplishment? Is it 1984 in Animal Farm, or is it Down and Out in Paris and London and Homage to Catalonia? It's hard to say, right? It's not that many figures where you can say that about. Vu Trong Phung is the same way, right? He's a great novelist and a great reportage writer. Is he more of one than the other? It's kind of hard to tell. The other similarity, as I'll now go into in a little bit greater detail, is that Orwell is, of course, fascinated by the great political movements of his day: communism, fascism, colonialism, capitalism. Vu Trong Phung also. It's the era, right, the 1930s, but Vu Trong Phung's writing is deeply influenced by, deeply consumed by these movements. And I argue in my book that it's not just that both of these guys are sort of consumed by these big isms of the interwar period, but that, and here I'm probably identifying a little bit too strongly with the subject of my book and sort of celebrating him in a way that biographers who are not careful often end up doing. But I basically say, look, these guys, in my view, sort of got, not only do they focus on these isms, but they sort of got it right. Orwell was interesting in that he was a Brit in the interwar period, was very anti-colonial. If anyone's read Berkeley's Days, it's a scathing indictment of colonialism. Animal Farm, 1984, Orwell was extremely anti-Stalinist, anti-communist during a period when a lot of European intellectuals were not, actually, and were quite sympathetic to Stalinism. Orwell was also a socialist and was very critical of capitalism. Many of his works are, quite strong critiques of capitalism. Vu Trong Phung as well. His writing, as we'll see, included strong indictments of colonialism. That's not that surprising given the fact that he's a colonial subject. But also, he writes very critically about Japanese militarism, Japanese fascism, and he writes very critically about communism, both in its Vietnamese incarnation and in its Russian incarnation. Orwell, as a British citizen, sort of is in a very good, or he has a kind of opportunity to educate himself about these different big movements that are shaping the world around him. As a British citizen, he works for 5 years as a policeman in Burma, and he develops his hatred of colonialism by working as a policeman in colonial Burma. As a sort of middle-class guy who doesn't need to worry that much about making a living, he's able to sort of pretend to be a pauper and live with the poor people in Paris and London, right? Again, it was something about his privilege. There's a certain kind of privilege that allows him to do this. Vu Trong Phung, and Orwell sort of travels the world. He goes to Spain and fights on behalf of the Republic. Again, it's a sort of privilege of his citizenship and of being a British person at the height of the British Empire. Vu Trong Phung, on the other hand, develops this quite similar sort of political vision, as a poor, uneducated, opium-addicted, sick figure from a sort of remote part of France's second-rate global empire. In many ways, Vu Trong Phung's, I think, quite prophetic political vision is a greater accomplishment, is a more remarkable accomplishment than Orwell's, right? This, in some ways, that Orwell has sort of the tools to develop these views, whereas Vu Trong Phung sort of develops them with much more limited resources, much more limited information. So there's my kind of endorsement. So Vu Trong Phung's reputation is shaped by this kind of remarkable biography that he has, but it's also shaped by these larger political controversies that swirl around him during his life and after his death. The first controversy is fueled by the coexistence within his work of two countervailing themes. The first theme, as I mentioned, was a deep hostility to the injustices of capitalism and colonialism. This is a theme that appears initially in his early published reportage, his study of the exploitation of household servants by their owners, or his study of the exploitation of urban poor women by a corrupt colonial police force. The evils of capitalism and colonialism dominate Vu Trong Phung's naturalistic novels. The Storm, as I described, has this supervillain who's this business tycoon. Dyke Breaks counterposes sort of poor communities in the countryside with incompetent officials and decadent urban members of the bourgeoisie. So it's a very obvious theme in his writing, this sort of criticism of capitalism and colonialism. But the second theme that fuels this controversy about his politics is a theme that appears in his journalism primarily, in particular his journalism of the late 1930s. And this, as I have foreshadowed, was a bitter hostility to Stalinism, both in its Russian and in its Vietnamese incarnations. On Stalinism in Russia, the key text was a three-part essay that Vu Trong Phung published in a magazine called Domsum Tapchi. Domsum Tapchi means Indochina Times, in September of 1936, entitled The Schism Between the Third and the Fourth International, a re-examination of the Communist Revolution from its origins until today. This three-part article provided a brief history of the Russian Revolution, including Lenin's early political activities, the revolutionary upheavals of 1905 and 1917, the first years of the Soviet Union, the outbreak of schisms and purges within the party, culminating in the expulsion of Trotsky and the first show trials in Moscow in 1936 and 1937. The essay denounced Stalin as an absolute dictator, and Vu Trong Phung wrote, and I quote, "Even though the Russian people have not yet lost faith in the mystical ideals of communism, 160 million Russians today are now facing starvation, and Stalin has acted without the slightest shred of humanity," unquote. The essay also condemned Stalin's denunciation of his political enemies as Trotskyists and fascists. The fantastic nature of these charges suggested to Vu Trong Phung that the confessions that had been proffered at the Moscow show trials probably had been coerced. And this is, again, a sort of remarkable insight of Vu Trong Phung. 1936-37, we have a kind of discourse by Western fellow travelers saying, well, these trials, maybe these guys did work as spies for Trotsky, or maybe they were working for the United States or whatever. But Vu Trong Phung, just basically by reading the French press, came to the conclusion that, well, no, in fact, these look like they're kangaroo courts. These look like they're not real charges. Again, it's sort of unusually prescient view of what was going on at the time. 10 months later, in August 1938, Vu Trong Phung published a blistering essay attacking the Vietnamese Stalinists who dominated Ho Chi Minh's Indochinese Communist Party. Entitled "Down with the Trotskyist Nguyen Van Phung," this essay parodied Vietnamese Stalinists' denunciation of Vietnamese Trotskyists during the Popular Front era of 1936-37. The essay depicted Vietnamese Stalinists, and here it's important to recognize that Vietnamese communism has many different streams and schools, and at that time, in the late 1930s, Ho Chi Minh's wing of the Communist Party was self-defined as the Stalinist wing. Ho Chi Minh referred to his wing as the Stalinist wing, and Ho Chi Minh's enemies at the time referred to that wing as the Stalinist wing. And Vu Trong Phung in this essay depicts the Vietnamese Stalinists, not Ho Chi Minh by name, but the Stalinist faction that Ho Chi Minh was associated with, as bullying, hypocritical, brutal, and Machiavellian. It also suggests that the Vietnamese Stalinists are handmaidens of foreign powers, that they're taking their orders from Moscow. Moreover, he suggests that the vicious attacks that the Vietnamese Stalinists launch on their political rivals, and most of these are rivals on the left, Trotskyists, anarchists, etc. Vu Trong Phung criticizes the Stalinists for dividing the anti-French, anti-nationalist movement. It's a very full-fledged, kind of blistering attack on that aspect of the Vietnamese left that eventually becomes the sort of dominant faction of the Communist Party. So this is writing that doesn't appear in his fiction, but appears in his journalism. Flash forward 20 years. 20 years later, the mid-1950s. Vu Trong Phung has been dead now for 15 years, and we get the rise of Stalinist and Maoist orthodoxy in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, during the 1950s. At this time, Vu Trong Phung, as I said, has been dead now for 15 years. His late colonial journalistic essays resurface in Hanoi, in communist Hanoi, and officials at the highest level of Ho Chi Minh's government now denounce Vu Trong Phung, deceased for almost 2 decades, as a dangerous political reactionary. Vu Trong Phung's famous depictions of sex and violence in his novels figure in this critique as well as evidence of his, quote, decadent tastes and tawdry commercialism, unquote. Constrained by the narrow parameters of permissible public political discourse in communist Vietnam during the era, liberals within the communist bureaucracy at this time defend Vu Trong Phung from these attacks on the specious grounds that the anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism in his literary writings indicated that he had once been a clandestine Communist Party supporter. In 1950, there's a very strange and kind of fantastic debate about Vu Trong Phung, in which the hardline literary czars of the Communist Party denounce Vu Trong Phung, say he should be banned, he's a reactionary, he's a rightist. But people who defend Vu Trong Phung, the only defense they have, the only instrument they have is say, no, 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 look at the anti-capitalism in his work. And not only is the anti-capitalism evidence that he probably was, had he lived, would he have joined the party and been sympathetic to the party, but they say, well, we know people who knew him at the time, and they say that he secretly was a party member, or secretly sympathized with the party, even though there's not really any concrete evidence for it. These loyal communist progressive reformists who are eventually come to be known as the Nguyen Zai Phum group are animated at the time by Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. And the project that I'm working on now and the talk that I'll give tomorrow actually is about this group. So this is how I sort of came to this group, by the fact that this is the group that defends Vu Trong Phung in the 1950s. These guys publish sort of revisionist, left, communist revisionist newspapers and journals in Hanoi during this brief period of 1956. This discourse that they spearhead is inspired by Khrushchev. It attacks Stalin, but it venerates Lenin and Marx and says we have to abandon Stalinism, we have to go back to Leninism and Marx. But a kind of secondary concern of these guys is to defend Vu Trong Phung. And you can see on the left is one issue of one of their newspapers, Nhân Văn, comes out in 1956. And on the left, there's a caricature of Vu Trong Phung. And there's an article inside the journal that, again, sort of makes a case for why Vu Trong Phung should be considered a great writer. At the same time, this group, this anti-Stalinist group of Vietnamese communist literary officials publishes a small pamphlet, which I have reproduced on the right, which is entitled Vu Trong Phung Với Chúng Ta, which could be translated as Vu Trong Phung is with us. And this includes short memorials, short reminiscence about Vu Trong Phung by members of this group, in which they basically try to make this case that Vu Trong Phung was a kind of leftist, a secret leftist writer. And if you look at the image, this is the, this image here, you can see it's very kind of striking portrayal of the writer as a kind of socialist realist labor hero. Look at that kind of strong jaw and thick neck. It's actually quite at odds with what we know Vu Trong Phung looked like during the 1930s. He's basically a scrawny, skinny, sickly, opium-addicted guy. Doesn't look anything like this. But here is the sort of attempt to say, no, Vu Trong Phung is kind of this, this sort of Stalinist, this Leninist labor hero. In any case, the Nhân Zai Phum group is allowed to make this case in 1956, but when the sort of Maoist faction of the party rises up and smashes it in 1957, 1958, the group is itself smashed, and Vu Trong Phung's reputation is a casualty of the defeat of the group. His writing is pulled from the shelves and banned in communist Vietnam for the next 25 years. Just as his fiction remains inaccessible to the general public throughout the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, it is criticized in academic criticism as an example of vulgar naturalism, a genre that is dismissed by communist critics as bourgeois and counter-revolutionaries. Communist critics, I think it's the same in China, use naturalism in a different way than bourgeois critics. It's a sort of very pervasive, pejorative term that has all kinds of negative connotations. And so Vu Trong Phung can't be read, but in textbooks about Vietnamese literary history that's produced by communist literary scholars, Vu Trong Phung is part of this vulgar naturalist school. With the relaxation of censorship that accompanies the post-war, post-1975 reforms in Vietnam, reforms that are referred to as renovation that occurred in the 1980s, a new generation of reform-minded cultural bureaucrats launches a second campaign to rehabilitate Vu Trong Phung. And in this case, the campaign is successful. By the start of the 21st century, multiple editions of his work are republished. His work is integrated in secondary school and university curriculum. Research institutes organize conferences about his work. City streets are named after him in both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. That's Dung Vu Trong Phung right there, with the Phung, the Trong covered with an advertisement for a apartment in the city. So this is, another long chapter in the adventure of his reputation, and I'm obviously skipping over quickly, I won't go into detail. But basically, Vu Trong Phung is finally successfully rehabilitated after the sort of Vietnamese versions of the Deng Xiaoping-esque or Gorbachev-esque reforms that are introduced in the 1980s. The reformists who are responsible for rehabilitating Vu Trong Phung during the 1980s come from a different generation than the failed defenders of his reputation in the 1950s. But owing to the uninterrupted domination of the Communist Party over the state and the public sphere in Vietnam throughout this period, the arguments that they put forward to salvage Vu Trong Phung's reputation are virtually the same. Without going so far as to suggest, in the absence of supporting evidence, that Vu Trong Phung had been a secret party sympathizer, Vu Trong Phung's new defenders in the 1980s insist that his work was intentionally crafted to undermine the bourgeois colonial order and to advance the revolution. And this is how Vu Trong Phung remains taught in school today, and with a handful of exceptions, it remains the dominant public interpretation of his work. Still, because of the length and the notoriety of the earlier ban on Vu Trong Phung's writing, a kind of taint of political controversy clings to Vu Trong Phung, and he remains a kind of shadowy symbol of resistance in some intellectual quarters to the repressiveness of the existing social and political order inside the country. I've gone on much longer than I thought I would, and I'm actually going to not present the last part of my talk, I think. But the last part of the talk, I basically turn to this alternative characterization of the politics found in his work that I call late colonial republicanism or Vietnamese colonial republicanism. I basically argue that French republicanism during the late 19th, early century, and early 20th century evolves in different directions than it had gone, that it had exhibited during its sort of formative revolutionary period. And anti-communism actually becomes a very important part of French republicanism during the early part of the 20th century. Politicians, writers, intellectuals who were at the forefront of Republican parties in France during this period combine a sort of criticism of unfettered capitalism and a criticism of Stalinism in their political project. And so even though these two things, anti-communism and anti-capitalism, from some quarters may appear to be a contradiction, if you look at this sort of French Republican, this late French Republican tradition from the late 19th, early 20th century, it's actually a kind of dominant view that's held amongst members of the French Radical Party, the French Socialist Party, as well as some of these literary heroes like Zola and Maupassant, the Vu Trong Phung follows. Zola famously was very anti-communist as well as being a famous critic of capitalism. So I think I'm just going to stop here. I'm shocked that I've gone on for this long. I thought this would be about an hour presentation, but maybe we can take a quick break and.
Maybe people will ask you about the questions of the last part.
Yeah, is that okay?
But then you can talk about it.
Okay.
Let's take a break and come back at 4 o'clock.
Okay, that sounds good.
And then we can come back for questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,